It was my first full-time job, a shipping and receiving gig at a small metal treatment company near Detroit. One of the ladies I worked with, I'll call her Debbie, seemed like a nice lady, and she was helpful as I was struggling to understand the computer system. However, something about her just seemed off. Her mannerisms, personality, and the look in her eyes just made me feel like something wasn't right and gave me a weird feeling. We had a common shared unisex bathroom with one stall in this facility, which was near my workstation. On my second or third week there, I heard what sounded like screaming and objects falling over in there. It was just her in the bathroom, screaming at literally nothing. From that point, I tried my best to avoid her, but she seemed to follow me around as if she knew I was trying to avoid her. I'd head up to the front office to drop off some paperwork or ask management a question, and she'd just be there, standing a few feet behind me and waiting for me to return to the factory floor. I complained to the floor supervisor, and he seemed hesitant, at the least, to do anything about it. I was basically told to just brush it off. One night, I decided to try and find her on Facebook. Not sure why, something just came over me. I didn't find her on any social media, but what I did find made my stomach churn. Dozens of news articles about her. 10 years prior, Debbie picked up her kids from school, claiming they had a doctor's appointment. She gave her 2 children a near-lethal dose of painkillers in their hot chocolate before drinking some herself. From there, she poured gasoline on the floor of her home, which was 10 miles from my shop. Long story short, she ended up pleading insanity and got a reduced sentence, and got out even earlier than that for good behavior. While her kids were falling asleep, she ignited the home. Her kids, who thankfully did not drink enough of the hot chocolate, managed to wake up and discover their home was on fire, and immediately ran to the neighbors, and that neighbor ran in and dragged Debbie out while the firefighters arrived. My heart dropped as I scrolled and saw her mugshot. It wasn't just a case of someone with a similar name. It was her. Her dead eyes stared through my phone screen. I was sick. I had to turn off my phone and go to sleep. Needless to say, it was an awkward couple of weeks at work until I could find another job and get the hell out of there. Back when I was 18 to 19 years old, female, I was house sitting with a girl I was studying with. The family we were house sitting for went to the same church as her, but I didn't really know them well myself. It was more to keep her company in a huge house. This was 1997, when the average teen like me didn't have a cell phone. During the week we were house sitting, it was a short break in the school calendar, which is why this family was away, and why the streets in the area were quieter than usual. My apartment, as well as the house we sat for, was not far from the university. My apartment was actually a 3-minute walk from it, and the house was a further 5 minutes by car. So being a student neighborhood, it was partially quiet this week. The first weird thing that happened the week I was at that house was that I dreamt I was driving through a dark forest on a windy, hilly dirt road, with no lights anywhere except for those from my car headlights. As I started to go down a hill, the headlights suddenly cut out, and everything went dark. The car slowed down to a stop and died. I woke up. In the morning, I went out to my car and it wouldn't start. It had been working perfectly fine the day before. I had to call a guy to come fix it. It was the starter motor. Well, that was the first creepy thing that happened that week. A day or two later, it was Friday. I planned on driving back home to my parents, who lived in a smaller town about 45 minutes away. I packed up my stuff at the big house and was going to head over to my apartment to collect whatever else I needed for the weekend. That trip between the house and my apartment was, as I mentioned, only 5 minutes or so away. Since it was winter, it was dark by the time I left, at around 7 p.m. As I was driving from the house, I noticed in my rearview mirror the headlights of a car behind me, tailing me really close. When I turned, it turned. Back then, I was cautious, but not overly so. Cautious enough to notice in such short distance that something weird was going on behind me. But then when I pulled up to a traffic light, it wasn't there anymore. Relief. Short-lived. The car was now beside me. I looked to my right, and there was a man inside, alone, smiling at me, slightly maniacal. For a moment, I thought, geez, I should really drive with a beanie on at night so people can't see that I'm a petite 5'2" female with long blonde hair down to my waist. I also thought, well, he's in the lane to turn right, so I'm good. I pulled off, and the headlights were behind me again, so close I could barely see them over the back of my car. What an ass, I thought. Who drives like that? Thank goodness my turn is coming up on the left soon. After another minute or two of this tailgating, I slowed down, strategically didn't indicate, and made a sudden sharp left into my driveway, opened the automatic gates, and shot inside. The gates closed behind me. Yay! That drama was over. I gathered a few things from my car to take up with me, and I noticed that on my way over to the stairwell that there was a man at the gate that had just closed behind me. He was still on the other side, and I was at the far end of the parking lot, but I could make out it was the dude from the tailgating car. He was jumping up and down, shaking the gate with absolute rage. Well, I was safely on this side, so I wasn't completely gripped with fear. And besides, there was a group of students making a noise nearby, arriving for a party or something. I headed to the stairs and started going for my basement, ground level to first floor. Rounding the stairs on the first floor, I noticed someone running across the parking lot towards the staircase. In hindsight, I still can't fathom why I didn't put two and two together. I guess it's because I subconsciously knew that there was a group being let in through the pedestrian gate. As I was rounding the staircase between the second and third floors, someone suddenly touched me. I spun around. The guy. He had slipped in as part of the small crowd. He said something. I said something sassy back and told him to F off. Then I turned my back on him to continue up the stairs. I lived on the third and last floor. He grabbed me from behind, held my back against his chest with his left arm around my neck. I felt something being held against my right side. Oh crap, a knife. He led me down. I remember thinking that the light was broken on the bottom level. This can't end well, but I was calm. I resisted slightly. He tightened his grip. I felt like I wasn't getting enough oxygen. I started to become a dead weight. He started to drop me. I was groin level. I elbowed. It connected. He dropped me, but spun around to face me, ripped the front of my button-down top. Then he stopped. He looked at someone behind me, someone taller than him. His eyes went wide. He turned and ran. I screamed. Then I too turned around to see who had come to help. There was no one there, but people came out of their apartments after that. The police were called. This was the second time that they were there that night. What? Turns out the other weird thing that happened was that my dad had already called the police, and they had come past an hour before. My mom had a weird feeling all evening and had hassled my dad endlessly that something bad was going to happen to me. She had been right. As it turned out, they caught the guy. I identified him in a lineup. He was a serial rapist in the area. He was accused of raping something like 14 women. One had thrown herself out the first floor of her apartment to get away from him and broken her leg. Weeks later, the police called me. Before his trial, his cell door had been left open. He was gone. Apparently, an inside job. Back when I was about 16 years old, because of my living situation, at least twice a month I'd have to make a 2-hour drive from a city area back to my parents' house in a rural area. I'd say about an hour and a half of that drive was just country road, with nothing but valley, corn, or some other crop on either side, with the occasional farmhouse or something that you think people might go in and out of willingly along the way. Because of how used to this drive I'd already been beforehand, I didn't think much of driving that long stretch of no cell phone service, no phone booth area. Nothing had happened yet, so surely nothing would happen ever, right? In the middle of one of those drives back, while the night was slowly taking over as I was driving, I saw a flash of light. That was weird. Maybe just a momentary anemic moment. Another flash. Well, maybe someone coming this way has their high beams wonky or something. Another flash. All right, something's wrong. I slow down a bit as to not get blinded periodically and swerve off the road and try to figure out what was ahead. Further in the distance, I think I see a person. Actually, multiple. My eyesight's well and good at this time in my life, so I was putting 2 and 2 together, getting close enough to realize there were 4 people on this shitty country road, line up across it as if to make a roadblock to prevent any cars from passing through. Another note is that I don't see any cars around them that they could have come in. I don't remember any farmhouses or sheds nearby either. The rest of this encounter felt like it took place in the span of an hour because of my anxiety, but it was likely no more than 5 minutes, in hindsight. I'm driving maybe 10 miles per hour now as I'm getting closer and realizing that I'm definitely without a doubt approaching a line of 4 grown-ass people with huge bright white masks on, staring in my direction. 2 of them definitely have bats or some other distinctly long, blunt objects, and one person is holding something that the flashes are coming from. I've seen enough horror movies and heard enough stories about crimes on roads like this that I thought I was somehow impervious to think that in that moment I only have 2 options: slow down and hope that they eventually part way around my car, running the risk that they could very well get the jump on me and my dinky car, or pick up the pace and disregard whether or not they'll have the chance to move out of the way when I potentially accelerate through them. I decided the latter. I had no means to protect myself other than a bat in the trunk of my own car, and at the time, I was a young teen who passed as a girl who could easily get knocked down with a solid slap because of my build, and my car was shit enough to where if I stopped, I wouldn't doubt someone could break in with easy force. Now hearing gravel and dirt kick up from under my tires, I was more freaked out at the potential that I could drive myself off the road, along with taking out some strangers, who I am now dead certain are carrying bats, as I accelerate towards them. I'm proper freaking out, but I've accepted that this was a decision I made from the adrenaline of fear of any situation. I accelerated more, and thankfully, the 2 that were directly in my way lunged out of the way, just in time to not get hit. I stopped accelerating to catch my breath, as if I needed to, and see them in my rearview mirror. The other 2, for some reason, trying to haul ass towards my car, as if they could catch up, and it became so real in that moment that there were 2 people who were intentionally trying to get the jump on me in the middle of fucking nowhere. Probably not just shit kids trying to get the kicks and giggles out of freaking someone out, but real adults trying to harm someone that came that way. I just focused on driving out of there as fast as I could. I focused on going forward, didn't turn the radio back on to distract me, and felt shook by the experience in general. The most fucked up part, honestly, was getting home and realizing that part of what I was driving on wasn't gravel. It was nails that were now embedded into my tires. Praise whatever God may be out there, or more likely, my own saved up money, for me somehow having those sturdy-ass tires. I didn't tell my parents the full story about what happened, and they just assumed I was being reckless and someone was just playing a prank with just scattering some nails about randomly on the road. I told the story to some of my friends, and they told me I probably wasn't in any serious situation, and they were just trying to get a scare out of me, especially since being in a car was a pretty big advantage in the situation, which I can't deny. Still, creeped the absolute hell out of me, and I remember it every single time I drive down a road that looks any type of similar. This is something that I add to the end of this story after having told it to friends beforehand, but this happened before the Purge movie came out. Otherwise, I would have definitely felt more comfortable saying it wasn't creepy and just annoying and bothersome. I still wonder where they came from, since I very clearly remember there not being a car anywhere close by, nor any buildings around, but I guess I could have been wrong. Made a note of it every time I drove it in the daylight. I know this was mostly in a car, but because of the proximity and near intimate relation between my car and an external human's body, it definitely felt like a personal creepy encounter, and I'll stand by that much. At least also given the potential of direct one-on-one human interaction, should I have slowed down enough. Had to tell this one to someone other than my friends, since they mostly heard the story, and I only just had a nightmare about it again a day ago, and I still don't know if I'm overreacting about the situation. All I know for sure is that those were definitely people, and I was definitely afraid. Edit. For clarity on the Purge movie mention, I had separate folks I've told this story to mention that there had been some incidents they'd known of shortly after that movie came out, of people scaring the absolute hell out of others using similar masks and being generally menacing, capitalizing off of people being scared, because they were reminded by that movie that some people would kill for fun, given the opportunity. The folks that mentioned it would say that'd be another reason to believe that it was a real mean-spirited trick, or prank, or whatever, to play on a stranger. Alright, this happened to me about 3 years ago. It was brought up recently with my friends, and they suggested that I post it here. I've gone through therapy for this and trained in firearms because this was the creepiest night of my life. I spent a night in what felt like a horror movie, and it's still so vivid. It was Wednesday night in the summer. I was off work, my husband was out of town, and our son was staying at his grandma's for the night. I was home alone with my dogs, an 80-pound Aussie mix and my 80-pound German Shepherd pit bull mix. I always have issues sleeping when I'm home alone, so I tend to just binge watch TV in the living room until I can't keep my eyes open anymore. This particular night, I remembered that the trash pickup comes the next day. I decided to turn on Game of Thrones for a bit, then I would take the trash out. All of a sudden, I realize it's 1:30 a.m., and I still haven't taken the trash to the curb. My house has 2 solid iron gates, one in the front and one to the side door, backyard. Lighting on our street or anywhere in our neighborhood isn't that great, but it's a quiet neighborhood with a lot of families, and you rarely hear about crime here. I looked out the window by habit before I took the trash out and saw who I thought was my neighbor smoking a cigarette outside of his gate across the street, looking directly at me. For context, this is a normal occurrence. My neighbor across the street hides smoking cigarettes from his wife, so he typically does it late at night in front of his gate. I get off of work late, so I usually see him, and we wave, say hi, chat a little, and then I go inside, and he makes the joke, "You didn't see me smoking if my wife asks." So, unbothered by seeing the guy, I go outside, grab my trash cans, open my squeaky iron gate, and take them out to the curb. I did not have my glasses on at the time, so as usual, I waved and said hello. However, the guy, who I thought was my neighbor, threw down the cigarette and quickly walked off down the street. It took a minute for me to register that he was not my neighbor. I was a little creeped out because he was clearly staring into my window from the opposite sidewalk. But also, maybe it was a guy taking a night walk, not unusual in our neighborhood, and just stopped for a cigarette. I thought I probably weirded him out as much as he weirded me out, went back inside and laid on the couch with my dogs to keep watching Game of Thrones. At some point, I fell asleep and I woke up hearing my gate squeak and my German Shepherd mix growling. He's extremely protective of our family at home, but he's also the kind of dog you can take anywhere because he's so friendly in public. My Aussie mix is more passive, but his sheer size and scary bark tends to deter people. He's very friendly though. I quickly got up and pulled back my curtain. My gate was still shut and I didn't see anything. My dog, however, continued to growl at my front door. I looked out another window, which had a better view of my front yard and porch. I didn't see anything. Eventually, my dog settled back down with my other dog, but I was still uneasy. I ended up watching TV again because I couldn't go back to sleep. About an hour later, I definitely heard my gate squeak. We are the only ones with a heavy cast iron gate, and the noise it makes is so distinct. So I look out the curtain while my dogs are continuing to softly growl. My gate is halfway open, but I don't see anyone. At this point, I'm panicking. In my panic, I couldn't find my phone. I grabbed my wooden baseball bat out of our room, crouched down, and started going through the couch cushions to get my phone. My dogs are oddly still quietly growling instead of barking, so I assumed no one was there. The minute I find my phone, my front door handle starts shaking. I run to the side door to let my German Shepherd mix out. I know he'll protect me and he can jump the 6-foot back gate. My Aussie mix, going crazy, busts out one of our side lights. I heard the guy say, "Oh shit," and immediately I let out my GSD mix. I jumped up to look out the window and I saw my dog latch on the guy's hand. The guy starts screaming and takes off down the street, my dog chasing him. I then become terrified he'll hurt my dog, so I run out with my baseball bat, screaming my dog's name over and over. The next thing I know, my dog is prancing down the street back to me, happy as shit with blood all over his face. I called the police. They took another hour or so to show up and didn't seem to take me too seriously. They said they'd call local hospitals, but I never heard back. I called my husband bawling, and he got on the next flight home. I stayed at his mom's for a few days, too terrified to go home. I did buy my dogs giant ribeyes for being so good and saving me. I don't know what that guy wanted, but since then, I've been trained in firearms and self-defense. So creepy guy, let's not meet because my dog might finish the job he started. When I was 11, my family moved to a very rural area of Minnesota in 1999 after living in a city in Wisconsin. We were surrounded by cornfields, and it was about 45 minutes to any larger town or city. I just want to set this scene a little because as a young kid who was used to the city, it definitely added to the creepy factor at night. What made it even worse at night for me was that a lot of times I was left alone. My mom was a night shift nurse, and my dad was a truck driver, so I would leave the TV on playing Nick at night so I could fool myself into thinking my mom was in the living room watching shows. I would also sleep in their room because it brought me comfort and was closer to the TV. Some may disapprove of this, but at the time there wasn't much to do about it. My parents needed to make money, and this was what they chose to do. Anyway, it was like this often, but one weekend my dad was home, which didn't happen often, so this meant I was in my room, which is right near the front door, and my dad was in their bedroom, towards the back of the house. We had a Springer Spaniel who was my best friend and who slept with me often. One night that weekend, I woke up to him not at my side and could hear what sounded like a dog, my dog, growling and whimpering. I got up, walked to the kitchen right outside my room, and I looked towards the front door. In the entryway, I saw the head of a man bent down near my dog, and I said, "Hello?" Not sure what the hell I was thinking as a young girl. I should have ran to get my dad, but I was worried about my dog, I guess. He stood up, looking startled. I don't remember what he looked like very well, but he was probably in his 40s or 50s, short, and looked a little disheveled. He asked me where a nearby town was, and I told him I didn't know, but could go get my dad. The man had taken a few steps forward, and my dog growled. He then said that he would figure it out and walked out the door. I ran to get my dad, and needless to say, my dad was really upset I didn't come get him right away. The man never came back that I know of. I don't know if he knew I was usually home alone somehow and tried to come in, or if maybe he was drunk and entered the wrong house, thinking it was his. It was definitely pure luck that this strange guy tried to get into my house on a weekend my dad was home. I know for sure that my dog may have saved me from something awful happening. I still wonder what he was bent down trying to do to my dog to make him whimper like that. I also wonder what would have happened had I not heard my dog. Anyway, that's my story. It was definitely creepy for me. A few years back, I was living with my aunt and uncle after moving to a new state. They had just moved into a new home in a new subdevelopment. In this area, door-to-door salesmen swarm new developments and new builds for water softeners, cleaning supplies, solar panels, generators, and the Kirby vacuum people. They wander the neighborhood all day, knocking on doors, but were usually gone by around 5 p.m. This particular evening, I was home alone with my dog, a mutt who is mostly black lab and an unknown mixture. He was roughly the size and weight of a full-breed Labrador, but he had a stockier build and long, wiry hair. He was a gentle, sweet baby who was upset if someone spoke harshly to him. I'd never known him to be threatening to anyone. My aunt and uncle were out celebrating their anniversary. This time of year, the days were getting longer, and we would have full dark by around 8 p.m. It was around 7 p.m. and starting to get dusky when someone rang the doorbell and knocked on the door. The door was one of those with a thick glass oval window, and I could see the door and who was there from the kitchen. I was going to ignore them, but unfortunately they could see me and continued to knock, so I went to answer the door. My dog followed me, but stood off to the side in the shadows of the dining room. The person at the door was a young man about college age, dressed in a collared shirt, tie, and khakis. Looked a bit like a Mormon missionary with style. He was thin and about my height, 5'8" to 5'9". I figured he was a salesman of some sort, but thought it was odd that he be out this late in the day. I thought I'd open the door a crack, tell him I'm not interested, and then lock the door. I open the door a few inches to speak through it, and he starts his spiel about Kirby vacuum cleaners, and he wants to come in and give a demo. 1, it's not my house. 2, I know once they get in, they aren't leaving without selling something, and I have no need for an overpriced vacuum. And I don't have $1,000 plus to spend anyway. I tell him, no thank you, I'm not interested, and begin to close the door, when he puts his foot between the door and the door jamb and throws his hands up to stop the door from closing. This is when I think, WTF? And I hear a vicious growling behind me to my right, and then a loud, deep bark, 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 as my dog lunges for the door. I grab his collar to keep him from going out the door, The guy's mouth drops open, his eyes get really wide, and he looks like he's ready to pass out or pee himself as he jumps back from the door and backs away, saying,
I'm sorry, wrong house,
and then turns and runs to the end of the driveway where a car with 3 men in it pulls up to get him, and they speed off, tires squealing. I told my aunt and uncle about it when they got home, and we told a few neighbors so they could keep an eye out for unusual behavior. It's possible that they were a team of Kirby salesmen. They do travel in teams of 4 and follow the door knockers in the car with the vacuum, but I was suspicious because it was late in the day for them to be knocking on doors, and it was a team of 4 men. Usually, they have a team with 2 or more women in the group because they are knocking on doors at a time of day when women are going to be home alone and unlikely to let strange men in. So a team of Kirby salesmen working late to meet quotas, or a team of home invaders. I don't know, but Cosmo wasn't going to take chances. So, for context, I'm an 18-year-old female who used to work at a 24-hour subway. I worked there for almost 2 years until I quit this past July for mental health reasons. For over a year, I was one of the store openers and would get there around 7 a.m. to start tasks. Keep in mind, I would usually be alone until around 9 or 10 when another coworker's shift would start. Even though I only have a few scary stories from my 2 years of working there, I and some of my old coworkers still believe it was somewhat haunted. Okay, so one morning when I was alone, I was standing in the back when I heard from the front a woman's voice saying, "Hello, hello, hello." It was almost like a loud whisper. Of course, my first instinct is that the bell we have on the door didn't work, and a customer is out there waiting. Except when I walked out into the front, there was no one there, not even a car outside of the store. The song on the radio was a familiar song from the 90s, sang by a male artist, so there is no way it could have been that. And why would an artist put background vocals of a creepy whisper in a song anyways? I remember hearing the first hello and turning my head and listening more carefully as it said hello 2 more times. So I know for a fact I did not imagine it. After this instance, I had another a while later where I was in the back and heard one of our bread cabinet doors slam shut out front. This is a very distinct noise for anyone who has worked in a subway because we are constantly getting bread and closing the cabinets. Immediately after I heard it shut, I ran out of the back to again see nothing. No customers, no cars out front, nothing. We also don't like to keep bread cabinets open since air could get in and make the bread stale. So I know for a fact I did not leave it open for the wind to shut it. My last story happened more than once on different occasions, and I would like to think that this was the spirit messing with me and wanting me to think I was crazy. Again, I would be in the back alone when I would hear what sounded like somebody sweeping the floor in the front towards the cash register. It was a swoosh noise that would happen over and over again for at least 3 seconds at a time. The thing is that I would move slightly and it would start, and when I stopped moving, it took another second for it to stop, so I knew it wasn't me making the noise. For example, I would take a step, swoosh. I would stop, swoosh, and then it would stop. It would happen sometimes 5 times in a row until I would walk to the front that is 3 feet away and see nothing. It would only happen when I was alone and would start to happen when I was just sitting or standing around on my phone in the back. I feel like the spirit wanted me to think that I was the one making the swoosh noise, while also making me feel creeped out at what I was hearing. Also, whenever I heard the swooshing noise, I pictured a woman with blonde hair in a white dress, which I don't know why is what popped into my head when I heard it. At the time of these things last year, I was in a bad mental place and exhausted from always being out of the house, at school, work, or competitive dance, which is why I feel like the spirit only really showed itself to me, because I was depressed and I didn't have any friends at school. Even though those are my only experiences, I still feel as if there was a woman's spirit roaming around that subway. I grew up in a densely forested rural area in central Virginia, and like most kids my age, 10 at the time of this story, I spent a lot of time playing in and around the woods. My best friend and I had found a creek one day while exploring different deer trails through the woods. This creek we happened on was a very rare find and the perfect spot for us to play. It was wide and deep enough to swim around in, and had nice, soft, mossy banks on either side to rest on after we had tired ourselves out. The water was cool and clear, no copperheads, and no mosquitoes, because the water was constantly running. We were psyched. After a few hours of swimming, we had to walk back home for lunch, but made plans to pack lunch for the next day so we could have a picnic on the creek banks and spend the whole day there. The next morning, we set out for the woods at around 1 p.m., planning to have the picnic first and swim after. We entered at the same spot we had the previous day and followed what we thought was the same deer trail. It was not. At the point where we should have found the creek, we walked into a small clearing that was covered in huge, thick ferns. We had definitely never walked past this before, so being both hungry and tired of walking, we decided to eat in the clearing. We laughed and played around there for a while, spitting watermelon seeds at each other from our lunch. It was an absolute blast, and we were both in wonderful, giddy moods. All that changed, however, as soon as we packed up and set out to find the creek. As we walked on, the woods started to feel darker and colder. We got skittish, and I noticed my friend kept whipping her head around to look behind us. After about a half hour of walking, we came up on what looked like an entire overgrown bathroom, sink, toilet, and bathtub, all sitting arranged together and covered in ivy. It's pretty common to find weird shit like this in the middle of the woods, so we just walked on and made jokes to lighten the mood, calling it Bigfoot's bathroom. After another hour of walking and not seeing anything we recognized, we started to panic. Instead of trying to reach the creek, we were now just trying to find our way back home, or out of the woods at least. I told her we should follow the sun, and eventually we would come upon a road or someone's property where we could find help. She insisted on another way, and we began yelling at each other out of fear, and let's be honest, little girl bossiness. I told her if she thought she was so right, she should just go her way and we would see who got out first. So we split up. Now as an adult, I fully acknowledge I was being a stubborn brat and also an idiot. Worst possible thing we could have done. Not 10 minutes after splitting up, I began to hear someone walking maybe 100 feet behind me. Thinking it was my friend deciding to go my way after all, I slowed down so she could catch up to me. Instead, whatever it was, matched my pace. I slowed down. It slowed down. I stop. It stops. This went on for hours. The whole time I was going back and forth on whether or not it was in my head or there was really something following me. I picked up a big stick, swung it a few times to make sure it was sturdy if I had to hit someone, and trucked on. As it began to get dark, I came up on something that made my heart sink into my stomach. It was Bigfoot's bathroom. I had just walked in a huge circle for hours, despite being 100% sure I was following the setting sun west the entire time. Confused and frustrated, I sat down on a log and just screamed my little heart out while smacking my whoop-ass stick repeatedly into the ground. As I tried to collect myself, I heard the footsteps again, walking up on me from behind. I called out my friend's name as loud as I could. No answer. Then, after a short pause, the steps began to run towards me. I jumped up and booked it as fast as I could in the opposite direction. Now, this is the truly horrifying part, which I typically omit when telling people this story. As I was sprinting through the darkening woods, I began to hear what I thought were church bells. I looked up to see the darkest, deepest cloud I had ever seen in my life. In the middle, it was so black, it was like looking into the night sky, and the dark gray around it seemed to be swirling. It gave me a horrible feeling to look at, almost like the nausea you get when looking through binoculars too long. What sickened me further is that I realized the sound of the bells was coming through the hole in the cloud. They were deafeningly loud. I mean, really booming out of this thing. When I realized this, I stopped dead in my tracks. I felt a sense of absolute and overwhelming dread that has gone unmatched in all my 24 years on this planet. Something in my head began screaming that if I did not run away from whatever the hell that cloud was, no one would ever see me again. I would be gone. I did not want to run towards the thing chasing behind me either, though, so I made a sharp right and took off away from both. It was now completely dark, and I was running blind through the woods, smacking through branches, wheezing, and tripping every few feet for what seemed like another hour, until I smacked into something low and flew over it, hitting the ground so hard all the air in my lungs was knocked out of me. As I lay there trying to recover, I realized I couldn't hear the bells anymore. Then my eyes adjusted more to the dark, and I realized what had just made me go ass over teeth was an old fence. Grabbing hold of it, I prayed it would lead me to a farm, and sure enough, it did. I walked up over a hill about a mile to the back of a farmhouse, explained what happened, and the farmer graciously gave me a ride back home. I was covered head to toe in scrapes, oozing blood, and more exhausted than I had ever been in my life, but I was finally safe. It was past 9 p.m. when I finally walked through my front door. My friend had gotten back shortly after we split and figured I had as well, so hadn't told anybody I was lost, and my family just figured that I was still out after dark, which wasn't uncommon for me. They were shocked when I walked in beat up and crying. Nobody had been looking for me at all. To this day, I wonder how long they would have waited to come find me if I hadn't been lucky enough to find the fence, and if it would have been too late. So this was a few years ago, but I thought I'd share because to this day, it's one of the scariest things that's ever happened to me. Basically, a few years ago, my sister lived in this house share. It was a huge house, 3 stories with 5 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms. At the time, my sister was the only one living there, so all the other rooms were vacant. My sister's bedroom was on the ground floor, next to the kitchen. One night, I was staying there with her. She'd gone to bed a couple hours ago, and I was suffering from insomnia at the time, so I was in the kitchen talking on the phone with a friend. It was about 3 a.m. While I was on the phone, I got this horrible, overwhelming feeling of being watched. It was like something, not someone, was in the room with me, and whatever it was, did not want me there. I tried to ignore it and continue my conversation for a few minutes, but it got to a point where I straight up just did not feel safe in that room, so I told my friend I was going to bed and hung up the phone. I went into my sister's room, and she'd always told me to lock the door behind me, even when there was no one else in the house. It was a standard lock that just had to be turned, so I did. Then I grabbed my blanket and laid on the floor to sleep. I'd only been laying there for a minute or two when I heard the sound of the lock clicking and the door creaking open, and suddenly that feeling of dread was back. It took me a minute, but I finally built up the courage to turn around and check, and the door was wide open. While I was staring at the door, I couldn't see anything, but I could literally feel this thing watching me, so I just froze. I finally managed to reach my hand out to shake my sister awake, and she had to get up and close and lock the door because I physically couldn't move out of fear. I had a lot of experiences in that house, but that by far was the scariest to me. A little over a year ago, my fiancé and I sold our house in the city and moved an hour away to a rural town. We got an amazing deal on our home, which is rare in today's market, and have been enjoying our new quiet life, oceanside. Our home is just off the highway and sits on about an acre of land. We have a neighbor on either side of us, but the properties are lined by trees and a river, so it's pretty private. There's nobody directly across from us, and beyond our backyard is the ocean. It's probably important to note that our driveway is probably 100 feet long, so anyone who comes to the door is either invited or Amazon. When we first moved in, we were getting weird vibes from the neighbor on the right. A few times, we saw him watching us through his attic window that looked down onto our back deck. He would also emerge from the bushes and stand beside the gate to our fence that leads to the ocean. Overall, he seemed weird, mostly harmless, but we installed a front porch cam on the front door, just in case. My fiancé doesn't like to leave any lights on at night at all, not even a front porch light. This never bothered me though. The porch cam we installed has night vision, and the picture is pretty clear at night, so if anyone came up to our door in the middle of the night, we would be able to see them clearly. The camera has an app that sends notifications to our phones when motion is detected. You can also watch the camera on live view and talk to people outside. One night, we decided to go to bed early because we weren't feeling well. We did the usual turn off all the lights and headed to bed with our 3 dogs. It was only 9 p.m., but it was winter, so it was pitch black outside. The only light coming from a few solar lights we have on our steps and the street light at the end of the driveway. We were just dozing off when I heard a noise. I thought I was hearing things because none of the dogs reacted. Typically, one will hear a noise and start barking, and then the other 2 join in. I asked my fiancé if she heard anything, and she said no. Then I heard it again, and instantly I knew someone was at our door. Panicked, I told my fiancé to open the porch camera app and check the live view while I flicked the lamp on. She started off by telling me that if someone was there, she would have gotten a notification. When she picked her phone up and turned the screen on, there it was. Motion detected. We exchanged a confused look, and my heart jumped into my throat when she opened the live view. Standing on our porch was a young woman with no pants on. She was wearing a puffy jacket, and her shoes slipped on, so the heels of her shoes were crushed under her feet, like she left somewhere in a hurry. She had opened her screen door and was knocking repeatedly on the entry door while staring towards the road. She then shifted her gaze towards our cars and then tried to peek through the stained glass on our entry door. My fiancé decided that this woman was trafficked, had escaped her captors, and needed our help. I didn't say a word. I just sat there, watching this woman knocking on my door. I wasn't getting the same feeling my fiancé was. This didn't look like a woman in distress to me. Her behavior was strange and felt sinister. My fiancé threw on a sweater and was making her way to the bedroom door. I asked her where the hell she was going, and she frantically replied, "She needs our help." I don't know how I convinced her to stay in the bedroom, but I did. It felt weird to call the police because of someone at your door, but because she appeared to have no pants on and my gut told me to, I called 911. After I got off the phone with dispatch, we checked the camera again and she was gone. 20 minutes later, an officer called me. She thanked me profusely for calling and let me know that they had found the woman walking along the highway. I felt like the wind was knocked out of me when she proceeded to tell me that the woman now has pants on and was accompanied by a male. The officer further explained that the pair said that they were looking to use a phone. I explained to the officer that we have the whole thing on camera and there is no male in the picture, which led us both to conclude that he was likely hiding behind our cars or in the bushes beside the steps. I also explained that we don't leave any lights on, so if someone was looking to use a phone, why would they choose the house that's pitch black? The officer agreed that they were likely up to no good, and again, thanked me for calling. Nothing like that has happened since. I'll never know the true intent of the pantsless woman and her hidden partner, and my gut tells me that's a good thing. This happened nearly 20 years ago when I was 5. My family lived in a trailer park, and I basically had free rein to roam around, as long as I didn't actually leave the trailer park. One rainy day, a friend and I decided to meet at a playground in the center of the trailer park and hang out. Usually, we would have stayed on the playground, but for some reason that day, we felt like just walking around, seeing what kind of adventures we could get ourselves into. This ended up being an awful idea, and the adventure was not fun in the slightest. Due to the rain, there weren't a lot of people hanging around outside that day, so the streets we were walking down were pretty much empty. At one point, a car pulls up next to us. The driver was a kind of thin guy with a mustache. In the passenger seat was a much bigger bald man. They both looked old enough to be my dad. The driver rolled down his windows and looks us up and down.
Aren't you kids a little young to be walking around by yourselves?
I should preface this by saying that at this point in time, I hadn't quite grasped the concept of stranger danger yet. I obliviously smiled at him and replied, "Nope, my mom says I can go anywhere I want in the park." My friend kicked me, and when I shot around to ask her what her problem was, she had a serious look on her face and was shaking her head no. Luckily, my friend was way smarter than me and did already have a handle on the concept of stranger danger. The driver continues,
Well, you might get sick if you stay out in this rain too long. Why don't you let us give you a ride home?
My friend shook her head at the man. "No, thank you." She then proceeded to grab my hand and start pulling me away, moving ever so slightly faster than our previous pace. The car slowly creeped next to us, the driver not giving up that easily.
Really, I insist. Wouldn't want you to catch a cold.
My friend kept pulling me forward, and without even looking at him, replied in a slightly firmer tone, "No, thank you, we're fine." She started walking even faster, me finally picking up on her energy and matching my pace to hers. Then we heard a car door open. I took a quick glance back, and I saw that the larger man, who hadn't said a word at this point, was getting out of the car. My panic mode kicked in. "Run!" As I shouted, I turned to start running through the grass and in between people's trailers. I heard my friend running directly behind me. We didn't have any idea where we were running to. We just knew we had to get away from those men. After a bit, we saw her teenage cousin's trailer. We sprinted into it and burst through the door. Luckily, they were home and it was unlocked. We locked the door behind us and frantically looked out the windows, breathing a sigh of relief as we saw no sign of the men or their car. My friend's cousin ran into the room and upon seeing us, breathing heavy and clutching our chests, asked us what the hell was going on. My friend told her everything that happened. She told us to sit down on the couch and relax a bit, just happy we were all right. We ended up staying there a few hours, watching Disney movies. Her cousin then drove us to our respected homes, telling us she doesn't want us walking around without a grown-up or a bigger kid like her anymore. I had absolutely no protests to that. I never saw those two men again, and at the age of 23, I still sometimes lose sleep, wondering what would have happened if my friend hadn't been so smart, or if we hadn't been able to outrun that man. I unfortunately have a plethora of these kinds of stories. I encountered a ton of creeps as a teen, and this story is about one of them. Back in high school, I lived pretty closely to my school building. It was maybe a 15 to 20 minute walk at the most. In my senior year, I had 2 free periods at the end of my day instead of class. I took extra courses in night school and summer school the year before, so I'd usually start walking home around 1 to 1:30 or so. The area I used to live in was extremely quiet, to the point where depending on certain weather or time of day, it was unnerving to walk the streets. It was suburbia, but the kind where people barely come out of their houses. It was a super rainy day. The sky was murky and no one was outside, not even for a walk, despite it being daylight. I had my headphones in, listening to music on the way home. I was nearing a small library around the corner from my house, when out of the corner of my eye, I noticed this large van with tinted windows. No one was parked near the library because it was closed that day. Odd, I thought, that someone was choosing to park there now. I continue walking until I hear a muffled sound. Curious, I took one of my earbuds out and looked up to my right. The front seat of the van had rolled down their window, and I could now see the face of a middle-aged man with a mustache. I was confused, wondering, was he talking to me? And he drove slowly alongside me, presumably repeating what I didn't hear earlier.
Are you alone?
An alarm immediately went off in my head. There was no one in sight, and I was a small teenager who didn't know what to do. I panicked, put my earbud back in, and as I turned around promptly to walk the other way, he began to glare intensely at me and turn his van around to follow me. My music was paused, and I was pretending I didn't hear him. I had 2 choices, the elementary school coming up ahead, or back from where I came. The back of the elementary school was hard to reach quickly, and I was scared I'd corner myself in. I kept walking quickly, not looking at the van following me. I was on the way back to my high school. Once I got closer, the van sped away quickly. It was getting towards the end of the school day there, and the people were starting to leave. Almost hyperventilating, I go into the office and tell the secretary everything that had happened. I got my mother to pick me up, and as we drove home, I described the van to her. We reported it to the police, and the next day, I was picked up earlier from school. My mother, the smart woman she is, decided to drive by the library that day, around the time I'd usually walk home. It was quiet out, as usual. Then she saw a van with tinted windows, as I described to her. It was parked, waiting for someone, waiting for me. We gave the police the license plate and explained our concerns. When we checked back in on them, they told us that they found the owner of the van. He was renting the basement of a house nearby the library. He said that he was there waiting to pick up his kids. The elementary school wouldn't have been let out until nearly 4 p.m., so why was he hanging out there around 1 p.m.? It was clearly a lie. Police just said they'd keep an eye on him, and that they weren't within their rights to do anything else. Frustratingly, the last update we got was that he moved away shortly after, with no consequences. This took place around 15 years ago. I would have been about 13 years old. My dad has always taken an annual fishing trip with friends that would put him out of state for about a week. I have numerous stories about weird things happening while he was gone on said fishing trips, from paranormal events to someone attempting to break into our house. But this one is the most unnerving to people when I tell it. When my dad would go on these trips, I would usually sleep in my parents' bed. My mom and I treated it like a little sleepover and would watch movies, stay up late, even on school nights, and gossip. I remember falling asleep after a late night movie and being roused from sleep what felt like just minutes later. My mom is a light sleeper, while on the other hand, it takes a catastrophic level event to wake me up from a dead sleep. I remember waking up feeling as if something was wrong. The room was illuminated oddly, and there was a distant rhythm I was only partially aware of. I'm half asleep, and as I open my eyes, I can see my mom on top of the bed, on her knees, peering out of the window above her bed. I started to ask, "What's going on?" when she turned to me quickly and shhed me. I quietly joined her, looking out the small box window that was slightly cracked open, and the distant rhythmic chanting became more and more clear. Our house sat in front of a strip of woods. The trees aren't too thick, and you can see through most of the wooded area. The chanting was getting louder by the second, and the odd illuminations finally made sense. You could see a line of hooded figures in dark clothes, holding torches, marching east, chanting what sounded like demonic, dark things. It felt surreal and scary as we held our breath, waiting to see what they would do. Were they headed towards the houses to burn them down? Were they going to attempt to break in and sacrifice us? It felt like ages that we sat there, watching this line of people walk through the woods, their torches raised high and their chanting continuing through the night. But that was it. They just walked away. After what was probably more like 2 minutes, my mom and I laid back down and discussed what we saw, trying to get back to sleep. We told my dad first thing in the morning when he called to check in, but I remember him not believing us. He thought it had to be a dream or something. That kind of thing didn't happen in our small town in Ohio. But the next day, there was an article in the local newspaper about a lamb being slain on a makeshift altar on the east side of town. My dad stopped doubting us, and my mom and I got even more freaked out. My parents still live in that house, and we have never seen any other cult-like behavior in the area. But that one evening freaked us out enough that I decided to permanently camp out in my parents' bedroom every time my dad left town until my late high school years. If you stuck around, I appreciate it. Thanks for reading and allowing me to get this story out there. My friends and I were reminiscing about creepy stories this weekend. This one came up, and I haven't stopped thinking about it since, so I wanted to write it down and share. I was a 16-year-old girl and an avid runner. I ran anywhere from 4 to 10 miles a day. I had a few parks I rotated through and decided one day after school and before work to run at this pretty secluded park next to the river. It was a very hot day, and I knew this park had a lot of shade. I usually carried a knife or pepper spray with me, but forgot it at home and didn't have time to go back home before work. Coming in, I noticed a few moms with their kids at the playground, and what I believed to be one of the children's grandpas, watching the kids play. I love kids, so I always enjoy seeing them. Cut to me running my laps. It was getting closer to dinner time, and the families all started to slowly leave. This park was 2 laps per mile, so I was on the second half of mile 3 when I noticed all of the moms and kids were gone. I was a little uncomfortable since I believed I was all alone in this park. Something about when the moms were there comforted me, but now I was alone, so I thought. I'm nearly finished with mile 3 when out of the corner of my eye, I see the grandpa starting to walk the track coming my way. I'm confused since I believed he was with the kids, but all of the kids were gone. I didn't even see another car in the lot besides mine. And to make things even more creepy, He was sucking on a lollipop. Random, but somehow added to the creep factor. My body is telling me to flee, but I'm a stubborn teenager who was determined to run 4 miles that day. I figured I would run past him and be able to move on with my run. I mean, it's not like he could outrun me, right? I'm about 3 steps from him and doing all I can to pretend I don't see him, acting like I'm super focused and can't be bothered. Just as I thought I had made it past him successfully, he somehow grabs the wire of my headphones, no ear pods since this was 2010, and pulls them out of my ears. I turned around at him absolutely livid, but as a woman, I know I have to play nice to try and lessen my chance of being murdered. I look at him, smile, and say, "Are you okay?" He takes a long pause, still sucking on that lollipop, and then pulls it out and shows me this creepy grin that sent shivers down my spine. He looks me up and down and says,
"Like to play alone, huh?"
while grabbing a piece of my blonde hair that was in a ponytail. I smacked his hand off my hair, and I sprinted as fast as I think I ever have, back to my car. I had a 1994 Saturn that could only be unlocked manually with a key. So like any horror movie, it takes me a ridiculous amount of attempts to get the key in the hole. All the while, I can hear him walking towards me, slow and steady. Finally, after what seemed like hours, but was most likely only a few seconds, I unlocked my car and jumped in. I locked the door, and soon after, the old man was almost to my car. I start the engine and start to back out of my parking spot. I see the man try to get behind my car, but luckily I was fast enough, and he wasn't able to. I booked it out of the parking lot and didn't look back. I don't know what his plans were. I don't know why he was watching those children play, and I don't know how the hell he kept a lollipop in his mouth so long without it all melting away. I'm so glad I didn't stick around to find out. Fast forward to now, I'm 28 years old, and I have never returned to that park, even though it's the closest park to my house. Hopefully that man is long gone, but I'm not gonna go look and see. This story happened about 6 years ago now, but it still makes me wonder what would have happened if I didn't follow my gut instinct. I've always been very aware of my surroundings. Growing up, my parents and grandparents always instilled my sister and I to be well aware of your surroundings, especially when you're alone, and to follow your gut instinct if you feel like the situation you're in is off. Because of this, I've always left situations I felt a bad vibe from, no matter if things didn't seem too strange to others. Why take the risk? I feel like your body knows what's up, even if you can't see it. So anyways, fast forward to this day. I never finished high school, so I was doing a program at a college in order to get a certificate that was equivalent to a high school diploma in order to get into college. The college I was doing the program at was in the same city as me. However, I didn't have a car, nor drove, so I had to take the bus to and from classes when I had them. Usually the bus ride altogether took about 45 minutes, and I had to transfer onto a second bus at one point. Up until this point, nothing weird or bad ever happened while on my journey to classes. On this particular day, I had finished my classes and was waiting for the first bus to go home. Since my classes weren't regular classes, I usually finished before most of the students and the actual college courses got out. I only had 1 to 2 classes a day, which meant most of the time there weren't too many others waiting for the bus at the same time as me. The bus I was waiting for finally pulls up, and I get on as usual. I go grab a seat at the front of the bus, and I notice that there's absolutely no one else on the bus but me. So I get happy knowing there won't be many stops on my ride home, and therefore I'll get there quicker. About 2 stops later, the bus stops and a male passenger gets on. I think nothing of it at first, and I'm still glad there's only one other person, because it'll still be a quick ride. As the man walks to take a seat on the bus, instead of sitting on the opposite side or the back, he sits right beside me. Not even a seat over, literally right beside me. Now I'm thinking this is strange, because usually when I get on the bus, if there's plenty of empty seats, I won't pick a seat right next to someone. I usually enjoy sitting by myself, listening to music on the ride, so I decided to get up and go to the back of the bus. While I'm sitting in the back, listening to music, the male passenger keeps staring up at me every few seconds, and it's starting to make me feel uneasy. Up until this point, I didn't really have any alarm bells going off in my head, but the more he kept looking up at me, the more I started to get bad vibes. I eventually started having a really strong gut feeling like I needed to get off of the bus. I can't describe it, but the bad vibes I was getting were making me feel super uneasy. I decided I was going to get off at the next intersection where a stop was, just in case he decided to do anything or follow me. At least I wouldn't be on a side street alone, with no one there. So the next intersection stop is coming up, and I press the button on the bus to be let off. As the bus is about to pull over and stop, I get up to walk to the door, and I notice the male passenger get up too. I think that's really weird. I decided to get off the front of the bus, by the driver, versus the back, and the male passenger gets off with me. At this point, I'm freaked out, and I walk ahead a bit and notice he follows me. The bus is at a red light at the stop, and the doors are still opened, so I decide to go back onto the bus, thinking this man won't follow me. Wrong. He follows me back onto the bus. At this point, I'm really freaked out, and the bus driver closes the doors to drive away. I immediately say, "Sorry, I gotta get off at this stop," and he opens them again, and I notice the male passenger is again about to get off with me. Thankfully, the bus driver closes the doors and drove off. I don't know if he knew the man was following me and decided to not let him off, or if he just wanted to drive away. But as the bus pulled away, I noticed the man who followed me standing at the front of the bus, staring at me. At this point, I'm glad he's away from me, because I decided not to wait for the next bus, because I didn't know if this man was going to get off at the next stop and come walk back to the stop I was at and see me. I ended up calling my mom to come pick me up. I'm glad my gut instinct knew something was up, and I got off the bus before he followed me all the way home, because I live on a side street that's about a 7-minute walk from the bus stop, so who knows what would have happened. So sketchy man on the bus, let's not meet again. Okay, so first of all, I'm a longtime lurker of this sub, and of Reddit in general. I first started browsing this particular sub around 2 years ago, and it's helped me a lot in terms of searching for warning signs and such. Today I created an account for the first time so I could share this story. Anyways, today I, 21 female, decided to visit my city's public library. I didn't have a specific plan in mind of what I wanted to do there initially, so I just did some browsing. However, once I moved on to the second floor of the building, I noticed that they had a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle set up on one of the tables. So I made a plan to spend my time putting the puzzle together for a bit, and then check out a book I saw earlier once I was ready to leave. The puzzle had already been put together in bits and pieces by others, but it was nowhere near finished. I spent maybe 20 minutes or so working on it when this old guy came up and started talking to me. It was very hard for me to understand him, but he said he wanted to sit down and watch me do the puzzle, so I let him. The man seemed friendly enough. We exchanged names, although I gave him a fake name just because I'm a very cautious person, and he then started asking me about what kind of movies and music I like, etc. He also asked me what my high school major was, or just what I like to do in school. It's at this point that I feel like I should mention that I both look and sound much younger than I really am. I'm currently in my 3rd year of college, but many people mistake me for a teenager at first. As I continued working on the puzzle and talking to this guy, I felt more freaked out by the minute. I'm not sure if it was just a gut feeling or whatever, but something just seemed off about him. Between how old he was, he mentioned being retired at one point, and the way I could barely understand him, I just didn't feel comfortable continuing conversation with him. I did my best to hide it, but he could definitely sense how I really felt, because he kept asking me if he was making me feel uncomfortable. Me, being the absolute doormat I am, told him that he wasn't. Finally, right around the time I was about to make up some excuse to get out of there, the man essentially asked me for my phone number. His exact wording was that he wanted to call me, but I don't think it makes much of a difference. I apologized and declined, saying that I don't really just give my number out to anyone. He seemed extremely disappointed, and, without another word, he got up and walked away. I took this as my chance to go downstairs, grab the book I wanted, and get on the bus home. As I was waiting for my bus to arrive, I thought I saw the strange guy again, so I pretended to be waiting at another stop instead, just in case he tried to follow me or something. I don't know if it was actually him, but if it was, he did not attempt to talk to me again. He just walked right by me, and I got on the right bus to go home once I couldn't see him anymore. So, what do you all think? Did I unintentionally hurt some old guy's feelings? Or did he have other intentions by trying to get my number? I honestly feel like I dodged a bullet, considering I look like a minor and never told the man my age. But I'd love to hear some feedback. I've wanted to tell this story for a little while, but now that I no longer live in the same city, I feel more comfortable sharing. My roommate, 24 male, and I, 24 female, lived in a duplex house less than a block away from the university in town, so our street was always very busy with cars or people walking to campus day and night. The town is pretty small, but the side of town that our house and the college are on is considered the bad part of town. I think it's because it's older, and there is low-income housing on this side of town, but the crime rate in the city overall is very low. There were a few homeless people here and there, but I got to know most of them when I worked fast food, so I was familiar with the people that were considered shady around town. Until this situation, I had never had any issues with safety in the 6 years I lived there, and I regularly walked to work and school as I didn't have a car, and I have extreme driving anxiety. About 9 to 10 months ago, I was in my living room around 10 p.m. watching TV, and my roommate was in his bedroom playing video games. I had ordered a pizza a little earlier in the evening, but some of my order was left at the store, so I called the pizza place to ask about it, and they told me someone was coming to bring the rest of it. While I'm sitting in the living room, someone knocks on my door very loudly. It startled me, but I had assumed it was the pizza man because I was expecting them anyway, so I answered the door. I want to clarify that there was no peephole on our door, nor could you see who was on the porch from the window in the living room, so the only option was to answer the door. When I opened it, there was a middle-aged man I had never seen before, standing on my porch in a large puffy jacket, a black beanie, and big, heavy boots. I can't remember his face too well because it was really dark, and I was so shocked and confused. I said, "Hello?" and he took a small step back and said,
"Hey, is your husband home?"
I didn't really think about my response because I was so confused about what was happening, so I said no. Then he said,
"Oh, well, can you come outside and help me with something real quick?"
This immediately told me to get out of the situation, so I told him to hold on, closed and locked the door, and went to get my roommate. I explained what happened to my roommate, and he went outside to see what was going on. The man had fully vanished. It had been less than 5 minutes since I had closed the door and got him, so the man must have either run away or gotten into the car with someone and driven away. I felt like a crazy person because I was the only one who had seen him, and my roommate had just told me not to answer the door that late unless I knew who it was. I was really shaken up after this incident, so I called my boyfriend crying to tell him what had happened, and he came over to make sure I was all right. Things were normal after that, but I was still very cautious at nighttime because I didn't want this to happen again. Flash forward to about mid-February. It was about 8 p.m. I had been sitting in my living room watching TV, probably waiting on food delivery again, but I can't recall, when someone knocks on my door very loudly. Once again, I'm startled, but I go answer it. When I open the door, I'm almost certain that it's the same man from the last time, wearing the same clothes. He starts to ask me again if my husband is home, and I immediately slam the door in his face, lock it, and get my roommate again. Once again, the man is gone by the time my roommate gets outside. I'm absolutely terrified at this point. For it to happen once seemed like a fluke, just a weirdo at my door. But twice? My roommate and I go back and forth about calling the police, and finally, I decided to do it. I called the non-emergency line, filed a report, and a cop came to my house, took the description, and said that they'd keep an eye out for him. She asked me if I noticed anything specific about him, like if he had weapons or if there was another car out on the road, but I didn't see any of that. I left a note in my duplex neighbor's mailbox to tell them about it because I knew there was a girl around my age that lived there, and I wanted to make sure she was aware for her own safety. But she told me that he had never come by her house and never seen him. Nothing like that ever happened again prior to my moving out, but it stuck with me for a long time, and honestly still makes me wary to this day. Now, I'm very cautious when I leave my house, even in the daytime. It made me feel paranoid that I was being followed or targeted for trafficking or something. Thankfully, I now live in a completely different city with my now fiancé, and I feel a lot safer. Around 2007, I was getting my PhD at the University of Florida. I, 30-ish female, lived in Gainesville in a condo that I owned by myself. I had a friend who was walking across the United States. We'll call him Captain. Captain decided to spend the winter at my house, so we got a mutual friend to drive him from Alabama, where he had last stopped walking, to my house in Gainesville. We had a pleasant Thanksgiving, and then Captain just kind of chilled at my house for the next several months. It wasn't too big of a deal because I was mostly staying at my boyfriend's house, but it was a little bit much. When it was time for him to get back to walking, he asked if I would drive him back to the exact location he had left in Alabama. Looking forward to having my house back, I agreed to drive him one day when I was out of school. I don't remember what route we took or where it was, but I remember that the drive wasn't that long, relatively speaking. It seems like it should have been, but I guess it was about 5 to 6 hours one way. I dropped him off in the early evening and headed back for Florida. This meant that I was driving at night by myself in an unknown part of the country. Conveniently, the GPS technology that we had at the time gave me this extremely backwards route back to Florida. To get to where I had dropped off Captain, we stayed on the freeway for most of the time, and then it was about 10 miles off the freeway. Well, Google Maps, or whatever the app was, decided that the faster way was to take me on all of these little back roads through Alabama backcountry. Serious Deliverance vibes. Seriously. So I'm already a little freaked out, and occasionally checking in with my boyfriend to let him know where I am. I've driven at night alone tons, but my history with respect to strangers has made me hyper-vigilant. At some point, I became aware that there was a car behind me. I didn't assume that it was anything weird until the car stayed with me for several miles. Again, I had just shoved it off to maybe Google Maps giving them the same weird route. But because I was paying attention to the car behind me, I didn't notice when I pulled through some small town that I was taking a left at the wrong intersection. There were two intersections very close together, and I was accidentally in the left lane to turn left, and I was accidentally in the left lane to turn left at the intersection before the one I was supposed to turn at. No biggie, I figured. It's like 2 a.m. So when the light changed, I drove straight through the intersection and took a left at the next intersection. The car behind me did the same thing. I realized at that point that I was definitely being followed. I immediately called my boyfriend and asked him to look up the non-emergency police number for the area where I was. I tried to give him my nearest location, but like any dude who has never been the victim of any kind of assault, he thought I was overreacting. He was in the middle of something and therefore didn't look up the number for me. In retrospect, I should have absolutely just called 911, but I didn't want to make a big deal out of something that could have been nothing. But that nothing was quickly becoming something indeed, because I had been on back roads in Alabama without a gas station for a long time, and my car was in need of gas. That meant that I would have to exit the vehicle at a gas station that was probably not well manned at this time of night by myself. I was low-key freaking out. It didn't help that I couldn't see the driver of the car behind me. It was dark, and the car had dark tinted windows. Also, Alabama backwood roads are pretty damn dark. I kept looking in the rear mirror, but I couldn't get a glimpse of the driver. I honestly could not figure out why this person targeted me, and at first had laughed it off as some kind of Southern football vendetta. I had a UF license plate frame, go Gators, and was trying to convince myself that the person was just trying to scare me because they liked one of our rival schools. Given that I'm a tall woman, it may have been difficult to identify that I was a woman in the car. But either way, this person was clearly following me, and given that I had to stop my car, I was feeling increasingly at risk. Finally, my backwards woods route took me into a relatively larger metropolitan area. I was finally on streets with streetlights and businesses were still lit up. I started to feel safer, but I still had to stop for gas. I had already made a plan as far as that was concerned, but I wanted the guy behind me to know that I was on to him. So at the first intersection that was well lit, I turned fully around in my car seat and stared at him while pretending to talk on the phone. I did this for the entire time the light was red. I wanted it to look like I was describing his car and his features to whoever was on the phone. Not long after this, I found a gas station that was well lit up. I was driving on fumes and praying that I wouldn't run out of gas in backwoods Alabama. I pulled into the gas station so that my driver's side door was adjacent to the door of the gas station, jumped out, and ran inside. I let the attendant know that I was being followed, and he walked out from behind the counter and walked to the windows and said that no one was there. I was sure that the car had been behind me when I pulled into the station, but seeing that I ran inside, they must have driven off. I still have no idea what the guy's intention was, but he followed me for easily an hour and a half, like 100 miles. It felt predatory as hell. Thankfully, I was able to gas up my car under the watchful eye of the gas station attendant, and the attendant told me the quickest way to the freeway. My trip was uneventful after that, but I was still shaking and thoroughly pissed at my boyfriend for not taking me seriously. Stay safe out there. This took place around 2005. I was going to a local college. I, female 24, was in the computer lab, and some guy around my age sat next to me and introduced himself. I got creep vibes right away from him. I could tell he was interested in me, but he was being extremely pushy about it. I told him I wasn't interested that way. I never had a class with him, but he seemed to figure out which class I was taking, and every time I got out of a class, he'd be standing outside the door waiting for me, or I'd be sitting in the cafeteria eating with some friends, and he'd move his seat next to mine and start talking to me. My friends started to notice that he'd follow us around too. One day he asked me what my career plans were. I told him, but he said that he joined a company and would be making lots more money than staying in anything they offered at the college. He said that this company was having their monthly meeting that evening and that I should come with him to check it out. I was broke and struggling, so I foolishly agreed to it. He picked me up at the school parking lot and drove me. It ended up being a BS multi-level company that I didn't want any part of. At the end, we drove away and he said he wanted to take me to a nice restaurant. He was all dressed up with strong cologne. I said that I can't go and that I needed to get back right away. He started acting crazy, saying,
"Why won't you just go out with me?"
He started punching the wheel and screaming to himself that he was going to kill himself. I was terrified. I said, "Well, if you want to go out, you need to tell me ahead of time. I'm not dressed well. I have a big test to study for tomorrow," etc. He seemed to calm down and said, "Okay, we'll go out another time." But I was done, and I knew that I might have gotten hurt that night. I told the college counselor, and he was given a strong warning to stay away from me. He ended up leaving the school, and I never saw him again. So, I'm a college student, and last semester I had to go get dinner at 5:30 every Wednesday because I had a lab from 6 to 9. Well, one day, a couple months into the semester, I'm in line for food when this guy tries to talk to me. Immediately, I got creepy vibes off him, so I tried to talk as little as possible, answer in one word, stare at my phone, etc., and got out of there ASAP. A couple days later, I got food around that time again and decided to eat outside and get some fresh air. I'm sitting on this couch at the dining hall when the same guy comes over, sits right next to me, and starts eating. COVID is still big in my area too, so between that and him just being so creepy, I decide to get up and walk a loop around the hall before heading back to my dorm, just so I can make sure he isn't following me or anything. Well, after almost completing my full loop, I see him walking down the other side of the street in opposite direction. He didn't do anything, so I thought that would give him a hint and he'd go away. Nope. The next Wednesday, I had to get food at that time again, and as I'm walking to the entrance from my direction, he's entering the building from the other. There's a small foyer between the entrance and the dining hall, and as I pass by the entrance to give him more time to get away from me, I see him circling the foyer, waiting for me. I ended up going to the top floor of the dining hall, peeking over the rail to see when he left, then going down to get food. I started getting dinner at 4 on Wednesdays for the rest of the semester. My college was very safe. The worst that happened was crazy drunk frat boys getting the police called for mischief. It was your typical campus fitted with those blue boxes where you can call for an emergency. Now, when I walked around campus, I'd often scroll through Reddit or Instagram. I know it was stupid, but don't judge me. I was a college student. Anyway, this particular night, it was dark out, but only about 7 p.m. There were lots of other students walking around, and the campus was pretty well lit. Yet, for some reason, I didn't go on my phone this time. I just had this feeling that something was off. I couldn't place it, but in the back of my head, I felt like something bad was going to happen. The walk continued normally, and by the time I got back to my dorm, I had begun to laugh at myself. Now, these were apartment-style dorms you entered from the outside via a pathway. At this time, I was hit by a sudden feeling of intense fear, much stronger than before. I looked around the common area and noticed a light coming from my room. Something told me not to investigate, and instead I muttered, "Seriously? I forgot it?" and went back outside. I felt a bit paranoid for the next few minutes, crouching down behind the window like a crazy person. I began to think I was just being weird when I heard footsteps. I slowly peeked into the window to see a man I didn't know coming out of my room and pouring himself a glass of soda. He brought it back with him and disappeared again. I stayed there for what felt like forever, until about an hour passed and I heard footsteps again. He was headed for the front door, and I bolted to the stairway. I climbed to the floor above and waited for a few minutes before returning. Sure enough, he was gone, and when I entered my dorm, I no longer had a bad feeling. I checked the place thoroughly and found nothing out of the ordinary until I lay down to go to bed a few hours later and felt something weird under the covers. I jolted up and turned on the lights to find a few condoms wrapped in plastic. I'm not sure what would have happened, but I'm fairly certain now that somebody was waiting to SA me. I didn't recognize this man from class, but he definitely was about my age. I don't know how he knew me, but the thought that I could have been stalked without realizing it struck me hard. I never saw the man again, and I never got the same feeling on campus. Somehow, I subconsciously knew that something was wrong. I have no clue how, and maybe there's an explanation, but that bad feeling may have saved my life. Junior year of college, this random guy approached me and a friend working a booth at an activities fair and asked us to help get in contact with this buddy of his that he was supposed to go camping with. Mind you, this is winter in New Hampshire, so really fucking cold. So it was already starting to sound sketchy. Not only was the guy not a student at my university, but he didn't even know the name of this guy he was supposed to go camping with, nor did he know the phone number. He said something to the effect of,
"Oh, I was supposed to pick him up this morning and give him and his girlfriend a ride to the campsite, but she's not picking up her phone. Can you help me find them?"
He kind of knew her name, kept saying it was something like this name, or something like another name. I was mad creeped out, but pretended to help nonetheless, as my friend seemed okay. He tried guessing the name of this male friend, but all of the info he really had was the girl's name. His main goal in all of it was to figure out where he could find these people. He said he was trying to get into a building where he thought that they were, and he couldn't because it was locked. You cannot get into residence halls on my campus without a student ID. He even hinted that he was hoping one of us could help him get in the building, but we just shrugged it off with, "Oh, we wish we could help more, but we're stuck here until 2 p.m. After we failed to help him, we directed him towards the dining hall because we had no idea where else to send him. And he walked out of the building, and my friend and I look at each other and are both like, "Holy shit, did you get freaked out by him too?" I firmly believe that he was an abusive or jealous ex trying to find out where his ex-girlfriend and new boyfriend were. I really try not to judge someone before I know them, but something really just wasn't right with him, you know? P.S. This guy was 100% the Ted Bundy type. He had piercing turquoise blue eyes, was very handsome, had charming mannerisms, and a striking jawline. Not my story, but my dad's. Around 40 years ago, when my dad was still in college, he moved quite a ways from Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam to New Haven, Connecticut for college. He wanted to be near as possible to his college, but also wanted to overlook the city skyline. He had already received the Form I-20 and went to the consular at the U.S. Embassy to try to get an M student visa. He was a first-generation immigrant, and though he had taken a fair amount of English classes in Vietnam, he wasn't fluent and knew nothing about housing in America. This is why he went the cheap route and rented out a podunk. Don't know if that's the right word to use, but I mean, it was really shady looking. Apartment somewhere near Pine Tree Drive in West Haven. His landlord, as he told me later, gave off some serious red flags that he sort of brushed off because the apartment was only $250 a month. Firstly, the landlord's abode was directly next door to that of my dad's, and during his first night there, while he was getting unpacked, he heard a high-pitched screeching and weird opera music. Again, he brushed it off for the same reason as said above, and also because he was very tired. The next morning when he awoke, he noticed a chair by his bed that wasn't there before, and when he went to the bathroom, his toilet seat was up, though he recalled putting it down. Not only that, but his door was unlocked. He again brushed it off because he didn't want to stir up anything with his landlord by asking if he had come into his room, or by asking if it had been broken into, therein referring that the apartment was insecure. He also wanted to explore West Haven, as his college year did not begin until late August. He had come 3 weeks early. As he left, he specifically remembered locking his door behind him, but when he returned after a few hours out, he noticed that not only had the door been unlocked, but was slightly ajar. This went on for weeks until his college year began. Things slightly moved from where he had left them, articles of food missing from his fridge, and other weird happenings. Finally, my dad had had enough. One night, he decided to stay awake until very late and try to catch whoever was doing this, red-handed. That night, he finished his homework and then got to bed, but he remained awake, and sure enough, at around 2 in the morning, he sees his door handle turning and a hand sliding through. My dad froze. His blood ran cold. He then saw the landlord creep in and take some eggs from the fridge. Not only that, but the landlord then went to the bathroom, coming out a couple minutes afterwards. He then slipped out once again, leaving the door unlocked. This creeped my dad out like hell, which is understandable, but for some stupid reason, he still decided to stay at the apartment for a few more nights before he finally confronted the landlord. Money and wanting to save it does some stupid things to the brain, I guess. This was before mobile phones and even decent cameras that didn't cost $100+. And so my dad had literally no way to get evidence to show the cops besides mere accusations. The next night, he once more heard the odd screeching and weird opera music coming from his landlord's room, and he decided to take matters into his own hands. That weekend, when his landlord went out shopping, he broke into his landlord's room, and what he found was seriously effing disturbing. First of all, he found some weird sex doll, but when he investigated further, he found an old Kodak camera. Under this was some extremely low-quality pictures of him in bed sleeping. He noped the F out of there, taking the pictures with him, and went to the police station. He moved out of there shortly, and he later heard that this same landlord had scared other residents of the apartment off after hearing the odd screeching and opera music, and after seeing all of their things moved around. The building my dad lived in was since torn down, and my dad decided to just dorm at Sigma Chi. He at first opted to stay away from fraternities because of the heavy partying. We never knew what happened to the landlord, only that he would be facing some prison time. I seriously hope he was never allowed to be a landlord again. I was on a plane once and noticed that, although people were still boarding, there was a large number of seats around me unoccupied. The last people on, though, were all together and consisted of one large family traveling together. There were 4 adults and about 10 children, ranging from toddler age to high school, young adult. They had the usual look of a large group traveling with children, some of whom were shy and withdrawn, others who were running around, and the adults looking frazzled, trying to keep everyone and everything together. When they'd all been seated, there seemed to be some issue with the seating, as one member of their party was supposed to sit several rows back. The flight attendant apologized and said that it happens, that sometimes their computer will shuffle sequential seating, etc., but assured them that there was seating available for everyone. The family sat down, -1, and started with the usual, "That's a shame, wish they could sit up here," talk. Since it seemed that their party were surrounding me, I stopped the flight attendant and asked her if I could switch seats with another passenger. This caught the attention of the large group, perhaps anticipating a complaint, but the flight attendant told me no, they don't usually do that, and that everyone has been seated, but asked if there was a problem with where I was sitting. I explained to her that I was traveling solo and did not care where I sat, and asked if I could give my seat to the member of the family who was absent, as my seat would put them in the midst of their group. The family overheard and was thanking me as I retrieved my bag overhead and followed the flight attendant to the family member's seat. She explained what was happening, and I noticed that the family member, a young girl, maybe 12 years old, seemed in a hurry to get back to her family and thanked me 4 times. She practically ran up the aisle, and before I could sit down, the man who had been sitting next to her was literally staring with his mouth open and asked,
"What's the problem?" "No, that girl was sitting here first."
Red flag number 1, and the flight attendant explained to him what was happening, and he immediately looked at me and said,
"No, I don't want to sit next to him. Where's that girl going?"
She explained to him that there was no issue and nothing she could do now. I think she was getting the same vibe. Now, I want to assure everybody that I'm not in the habit of judging people by their appearance, but this guy was the definition of red flags. He was overweight and paunchy, that overweight with no muscle tone look some people have. Half bald, with a few strands combed over, thick glasses, and no chin. He was a mouth breather and kept his mouth open constantly, drooling on himself and then sucking it back in between heavy breathing. If there were a textbook example of a creep, it would be him. As I was putting my bag overhead, he started talking to himself under his breath about how this was BS, just my luck, wasn't bothering anybody, and why did they move that girl? I wanted to say something to him, but I didn't. It wasn't long before my neighbor got a call and was talking about an upcoming court appearance, and I overheard no victims testimony, and rarely show up, and people wouldn't ask me to babysit if I was like that. The only time I said almost anything to him was when he started blatantly watching porn on his laptop with earphones in, grunting, sweating, wheezing, and kept repeating, "Little bitch," when a part was on he evidently liked. Then took a blanket and covered his lap, his hands fidgeting underneath it. As soon as I saw he intended on keeping them there, I pretended to reach for the call button. Then he jerked his hands out and started muttering under his breath about me minding my own business. At some point, I got up to use the restroom, and when I returned, he was on the phone again, and I caught something about the ass on her. No, switch seats on me. Got away, haha. And he shut up as he saw me approaching. The creep went to sleep eventually, and fortunately stayed asleep the rest of the flight. When we were all deboarding, a woman I presumed was the mother was standing with the girl and said thank you again. I shudder to think how he acted in the short amount of time she was next to him, or how he would have if she had remained there. Shocking absolutely no one, including himself, he he was met at the gate by security and police, and as he was being led away, he said,
"This isn't my laptop, by the way."
This happened almost a decade ago when I was 13 years old. I remember my friend and I were excited about our first time trick-or-treating without our parents. We lived in a small town where nothing ever happens, and we thought it would be the same that night. It started like any other Halloween night. We collected our candy, ran into many of our classmates, and had a lot of fun. At 8 p.m., we realized that we had to head home, but on the way back, we dropped by our teacher's house. She wasn't home, and the streets didn't have many streetlights. To add to this, most of the houses had their lights turned off, and their Halloween decorations were taken down. My friend and I were slightly spooked and disappointed by the lack of candy. We wanted to get out of the street as soon as possible. That's when a man emerged from under one of the few streetlights. It was a police officer. Neither of us seemed to notice him before this, possibly due to the darkness. He startled us, but seemed very friendly. The cop introduced himself and pointed to an inconspicuous bungalow. He said an older man living in this house was inviting trick-or-treaters inside. Someone called the police, but when he arrived, no one was answering the door. He kept telling us his police car and partner were just around the block. We looked around, but couldn't see them. I was a pretty paranoid kid. Growing up, my mom loved watching crime shows, and she'd always tell me tidbits of lessons. One of these was a story about fake cops. Although I don't remember the details, I remembered people can pretend to be police officers to gain trust. Throughout this whole exchange, I was terrified. His lack of badge, police car, and partner did not feel right. I was also conflicted because he was smiling and seemed like he just wanted to help. That was until we heard his strange request. He said he needed to speak to this potential predator and needed our help. Since we were young girls, the man would answer if we knocked. The officer claimed that he would hide behind the bushes next to the front door. He would wait for him to invite us in, jump out, and catch him red-handed. At that moment, I knew my friend felt the same way I did. We both fell silent, but one of us managed to ask if we could discuss. The cop said yes, but told us we had limited time. The street was silent, and he could hear everything. I remember the feeling of wanting to say something, but fearing that he would hear us and escalate the situation. We just stared at each other for what felt like forever. The cop was getting increasingly impatient and told us that we had to decide quickly. Around that moment, a family came down the street and noticed the officer. They were coming over to see what was happening. That's when the cop said he'd be right back and to not go anywhere. My friend and I scrambled to collect our thoughts and decided to run away. We sprinted out of the street and didn't look back. On our way home, we discussed theories that ranged from him being a fake cop, him playing a prank on us, or him being a real cop, but we misunderstood the situation. When we told our parents, we downplayed it a lot and doubted our experience. In the end, we didn't call the police, but our dads drove to the house and area around the house. No cop cars or police officers were in sight. Over the years, I can say that I regret not calling the police. At the time, my friend and I were convinced we misunderstood what happened. We even told our class the next day, and most, including our teacher, thought it was not alarming. Looking back, I find it extremely strange a police officer would put two children in such a potentially dangerous situation. Moreover, with our parents not present. I wonder what his motives were, but it will, unfortunately, remain unsolved.